Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, February 22nd, 2018. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Also inside this studio, it's the A-Team. We are back. That is Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAFighting.com. That is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post. And of course, that is the anchor himself, Chuck Mindenhall, a.k.a. the man in the hat of The Ringer and MMAFighting.com. All right, guys, another week, another show, more topics to discuss in the world of mixed martial arts. Let's start this week with a guy that we haven't talked about all that often as of late, but I do believe it's worth talking about him right off the bat. Let's talk about Donald Cowboy Cerrone. Goes into Sunday night on a 3-fight losing streak, and I think that's why maybe his record-tying win kind of crept up on us. I remember us talking that he was close to tying the record for the most amount of wins inside the octagon, 20, but because he hadn't won in so long, I feel like that sort of narrative went away. He wins on Sunday against Yancy Medeiros. He now has 20 victories inside the octagon. He ties Michael Bisping and GSP for the most wins in UFC history. And so it got me thinking about his legacy and kind of where he stands. And then it occurred to me, Donald Cowboy Cerrone might be the best fighter to never win a major title in MMA history. Do you agree with that? Is he the best fighter to never win an MMA major title? When I say major title, I mean Pride, WEC, Strikeforce, UFC. You know, he won an ROF, Ring of Fire
That's not
title.
nothing.
It's not nothing, but it was like, you know, over a decade ago. I'm talking about like a major organization.
Yeah, for me, the answer is no. I think it might be Yoel Romero.
Interesting,
Because
wow.
Yoel has beaten Jacare, he's beaten Machida, Luke Rockhold, Chris Weidman. 4 champs. That's kind of a ridiculous resume. But here's what I will say. He has wins, Donald Cerrone does, over Eddie Alvarez, former champion, Benson Henderson, although he lost to Henderson the first time, but has a nice rebound win. But I was looking at I was looking at a series of stats that I found about his career, the wins, how many knockouts he has, win streaks, all kinds of different ways you can sort of package a guy's achievements, and it just looked like this is what it would read if a champion. We were discussing a champion. Like, only champions have resumes like this. Not really the aggregate total of wins, but this sort of nature of finishing guys and how many bonuses they got, and you know what kind of ranked fighters they beat. He is in this weird position where if he's not better than Yoel Romero in terms of the question you asked, he's number 2 probably. I think he's got a better resume than Faber in that regard. But more to the point, let's say he is number 1. He exists in this sort of weird space where he never was a champion, but he's clearly better than just about everyone else who also was not a champion. It's almost like he's occupying this little space by himself. I mean this as a compliment. I know it's going to sound like I'm thrashing my own team. It kind of reminds me of the Washington Capitals a little bit, right? Like maybe when it comes to those championship teams,
I get
the Penguins, he can't get it, but he will smash just about everybody else. It's really impressive.
Yeah, I don't know whether he's that guy that you're asking about, but what I would say is pound for pound the most joy-filled fighter that I've ever seen in terms of wanting to be in there fighting. That it just seems as though everybody has an agenda. You know, some fighters go in there because they want to make a ton of money. Some fighters go in there because they want that championship belt. Some fighters go in for this reason or that reason to escape something from their past. But one thing about Cowboy Cerrone is that he always wants to be in there. And I was thinking about that in the lead up to this fight. As you said, he was on a 3-fight losing streak. And, you know, it was almost like he's kind of resigned to his career kind of going down a few notches. But he still even entered into that fight with the kind of just a joy, really. A joy of wanting to be there and put everything he has into the fight. And for that, I would say that pound for pound, you know, I can't think of anybody who tops that.
Part of the thing with him is he just downplays his own achievements to the point where even when he got into a title shot with RDA, where, you know, it almost felt like, yeah, well, this is just where I ended up after winning a bunch of fights. It was never like that was his crusade either. So it's not like he's, you know, he's actually, remember him saying, like, at some point when he had a bunch of wins, he didn't end up getting a title shot. He put it out of his mind. He didn't want to think like that anymore. And that kind of, I think, became like a collective mindset when you're watching a guy like him. So he was more that anywhere, anytime guy who would show up, you know, maybe 5 times in a calendar year. And that's sort of unprecedented. Like, when you really think about that, you think, what, since 2011, I believe, is when he made his debut, 20-something, like 28 fights in the UFC, that's ridiculous. He's won 700, like somewhere in the range of $700,000 in bonus money. And it's like, that's almost $100,000 bonus money alone. It's like his what he wanted to accomplish, I think, is not just going for the gold. I think he just enjoys getting in there. And I think he's kind of a daredevil. He's kind of a spur of the moment kind of guy, and he likes to spend money, likes to buy boats, and then he wants to get back in there and pay for the boat and things like that. His story is kind of like that, you know what I mean? And for whatever reason, I mean, he's beat all these guys. I think you're right. He lost these fights, and right in that sweet spot is when GSP and Bisping came in, and we're talking about that. You did forget for just a minute, but ultimately, man, when you look back at his career, I mean, it just seems like he's always there. He's always there. He's always hovering in a top spot, like somewhere in that top 5-ish area. And I mean, the guys he beat, even making the transition to 170 and being able to do it, it's a hell of a career. And I saw somebody was like trying to gauge, is he a Hall of Famer? And that's a really interesting question. And so, but when you really look at it, like you just said, you go down his resume, like, yeah, he should be, considering the kind of guys we're considering Hall of Famers, he should be even without the belt.
He certainly has been Mr. Reliable for the UFC, but I actually disagree with both of you when you say that he exudes.
He's a wreck.
Yeah, he's a wreck. He's actually a wreck. Like, to me, I see a guy because he's talked about it, how he's like scared out of his mind, how he's nervous, how he's anxious. He actually just recently did a solid sit down with MMA Junkie talking about this, how like the mental side of the game, if you talk to his coaches, has always been his weakness. So I wonder if part of the legacy is this was a great fighter, but at the end of the day, when it mattered most, yeah, he got the wins. Yeah, he was able to be active, but he just couldn't win the big one. And by the way, that's a knock, if you want to call it a knock, on many of the greatest athletes of all time. I mean, my favorite athlete is Patrick Ewing. The knock on him was he never won a ring. Yeah. Donald Cerrone, the knock on him is he never won the big one, and he never won the big one because when the lights shine the brightest, he didn't step up to the plate and deliver.
Funny,
I mean,
though,
look at the RDA fight. Look at that. Look how that went.
All of what he has to go through to get into a fight.
Yeah.
It's just maybe conquering doubt is his thing. I mean, you know what I mean? Like he conquers himself to get in there every single time and to perform at the highest level. In most cases, I know, like in that RDA fight and against Benson Henderson, we didn't see the best version of him, So maybe the brighter got maybe it played more over him. But honestly, man, the guy always has just such a cool demeanor. He hides it well, but maybe just conquering that doubt is really the whole game to him.
As the stakes get higher, yeah, maybe he hasn't been able to this point to raise his game to that level, that little like hair's bit that he doesn't quite have. So maybe that's a knock, but I still maintain that he's a guy, that he's a fighter's fighter. And despite that, that anxiety that might have plagued him when it came to be the big moment, the big spotlight moment, he still is a guy who always is willing to be in there and always seemed to be relishing the moment to be in there. And yeah, I think that the anxiety for him, in my mind, was always the stakes, not necessarily the fight.
What's interesting to me is think about the weight classes too. In 155 and 170, you know how hard it is to win a title in those weight classes. Sure. Like Couture, you can really say, wow, he beat light heavyweight when light heavyweight was like the marquee division. The heavyweight stuff, it's a little bit different. So he got the 2 titles in 2 weight classes, but in part because he was competing in a relatively shallow division. You have to really contrast Cerrone to somebody like BJ Penn. Because for a time, you can basically say, now the Matt Hughes fight's a little dicey, the first one, but at least at lightweight, you can say for a time, no doubt about it, that was the best guy in the world at that time when he held that belt, for whatever period you want to define that as, up until the Frankie Edgar fight, the first one. Cerrone's never been that guy. He's never been clearly that's the guy in that division. But wow, man, he's been hanging around the rim for a little while.
Absolutely.
He's been hanging around. He has been there for a very long time, real longevity, as you pointed out. So it's really interesting. BJ Penn has had this collapse, and he was kind of all over the place, but he had these peaks, and we just sort of count the peaks. Maybe there's a case to be made that, well, the peaks do matter. Clearly they matter, but maybe there's a case for high-level consistency over time, and he definitely has that.
And I'll go back to the Mr. Reliable title. Never in a boring fight. I mean, off the top of my head,
Second Henderson fight was boring.
Second Henderson fight was boring.
The jury one was boring.
It was a kind where they were it was not like the Medeiros fights that they were hugging. They were hugging.
Benson Henderson?
Yeah.
Okay, wait. So he lost to Benson Henderson at WEC 43, which was one of the best fights of the year. San Antonio.
Yes.
Then they rematched on the pay-per-view. 48.
Yeah, it was like a boring striking fight, which sounds crazy.
But he got submitted within a couple minutes. Remember with the guillotine?
Who?
Cerrone did.
Sure, that's not Varner? No, he beat Benson Henderson in the rematch. Or was it the third one? Or was it the third? I can't remember.
When was the third one? Did they?
After Henderson had lost the title, I believe.
Okay, yes. Well, that was the third one. That was in the UFC.
Yes.
I was thinking of the two WC
Sorry, my
fights.
mistake.
Yes.
I meant their UFC fight.
Yes. Okay, fair enough. But we're talking about
Yes,
you're picking
you have to
one
parse- you
that I
have to
hardly
parse the
even remember.
resume.
Maybe.
Yeah.
So, but my point is, he's almost in a way, and we could talk about him being a throwback because he is a throwback fighter in the way he fights, but he's also a throwback fighter in this day and age where the UFC, and I know you've talked about it recently, and we've talked about it on this show recently, is having a hard time getting guys to take fights. And this is literally a guy, anytime, anywhere, he's taking fights on short notice, on long notice. He's stepping up to fight Darren Till. He doesn't even know who Darren Till is in Poland.
That's crazy.
You know what I mean? Like, so in that way, I think his legacy to me, when someone asks me about Donald Cerrone, I don't even know if the first thing that will come to mind is that he never won the big one. It was that he really was a perfect soldier for the UFC. And that's what makes his involvement in the association for that week so bizarre, because it seemed like they were always on the same page. But especially in this day and age where it seems like there's always some kind of problem with getting, like, I bet you if the UFC offered him James Vick tomorrow, he takes that fight. No one else wants to take that fight, and he'll take it at 155. And that's refreshing. And I don't blame these fighters for saying no and being a lot more business conscious and looking out for their own, best interests, especially when the UFC will cut you, on a 2-fight losing streak. But it is nice to see him still thriving, still doing well, and not letting the losing streaks, really set him back. 3 fights in a row he loses, he comes back in a main event and beats a guy who's on a 3-fight winning streak.
Yeah.
That sticks out these days when 5 years ago it didn't stick out.
You can always see who the junior reporters are, or the like the local media is, whatever town you're in, if Cowboys fighting, because they'll ask him, "Hey, would you fight so and so?" "Yeah, sure."
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you'll fight so and so. Yes, of course.
Yes.
And they'll go down the row until they realize he's just going to say yes. It doesn't matter the name. The veteran reporters would have to find another angle about it.
Yeah.
I think you're right. He's the last of the Mohicans, man. He
Yeah.
really
I
is the
thought it was
last
cool
of the
too that there for a while he started to develop a stigma that he would get nicked up early in a fight. Like, if you're going to catch him, you catch him early. Some guys might be able to put him away. I remember the Melvin Guillard fight when he got him in Denver and things like that. We saw that, and then all of a sudden he switches that even. Like he comes out a little differently, and people think he's going to strike. All of a sudden, he's going for submissions. He was good at kind of just adjust the knobs a little bit before a fight, just to keep people guessing. So in my mind, he was more than just a guy who went out there and threw an accommodating spectator fight. Like he still fought smart in a lot of situations, or you had a guy dialed in more than we realized.
There's also something to be said for the way he markets himself, and he's not like great. He doesn't love doing media. It's very hard for him to.
He loves endorsing Budweiser.
But I mean, like, that whole thing, it's just little things. The hat, the way he speaks, the way he dresses. In this day and age especially, but even back then, that stuff's, it stood out. Like the Tap Out show that he was on. Just doing those little things in the fight game, I think, gives you longevity. And we're seeing now, like, he's just as, fans love the guy, no matter what. He can lose 3 in a row, and it doesn't feel like he's less popular. And how many guys does the UFC have, or females on their roster right now who have not won a belt, who have not been in like pay-per-view main events consecutively? He's never headlined a pay-per-view. And yet they could still trot him out on FS1 and it feels like a big fight, right?
On a 3-fight losing streak.
Yeah.
Right.
There's not that many people.
And just by the same token that you were referring to him, when he rises up to a title fight, he doesn't quite get over the top there. Here he's on a 3-fight losing streak, and that's a time when a fighter is typically going to be a little bit, close to the vest. I got to play it safe. I got to get the win. He didn't fight the other night like a guy who's thinking, I got to get the win. He fought like he was fighting.
Sure.
And so it's kind of like the anxiety of trying to rise to the top of the game didn't strike him when the moment came where he could be down and out. I don't know that the UFC would have got rid of him after a 4-fight losing streak because he's such a popular guy, but still, you don't want to end up being that guy.
Sure. Now, Luke, I got to ask you about Yancy Medeiros in this fight, because to me it felt like he played right into Donald's hands. Mm-hmm. The buddy stuff, the hugging, like I didn't really know that there was this, kinship between them. And maybe there's just that mutual respect. They're both fighters. They're down, anytime, anywhere. But to me, when you're dealing with a guy who, the mental side of the game is his biggest weakness, you don't want to, relax him by being his buddy. You want to come forward. You want to pressure him. And I felt like Yancy Medeiros had an opportunity.
Pressure him in the fight.
No, but I mean like the hugging, the bro, all that stuff. You want to be his enemy. You don't want to be his friend and make him feel like, oh, this is great, this is relaxed, because I feel like that plays into his hand. When you're Nate Diazing him, when you're up in his face and you're bringing
Flipping
out
his hat off.
Exactly. Then it seems like in the past I felt like Yancy kind of. He had a big opportunity to go on a 4-fight winning streak in his first UFC main event.
Signature win, too.
Yeah, and he kind of dropped it in that.
Yeah,
in that
a little
regard.
bit. I mean, you'll talk to a lot of fighters, and I've seen it in the gym personally. They'll have a guy, and their favorite guy in the gym is the one that gives them the most trouble. That's the one they usually gravitate to. The good ones, anyway.
Yeah.
The bad ones will avoid it, but the good ones, they like the guy that absolutely gives them the dogfight. And I think he was sort of anticipating that, and I think he sort of admired what Donald's done from afar. I agree. In terms of technical stuff, I mean, I'm not going to get into it, but he definitely, he lost because Donald was a better fighter. I want to be very clear about that, at least on that night. On that night, he was the better fighter. But I agree, there was probably an approach that could have been different. But Yancy's one of these guys, man, where I just got the sense that, I made this point, it was maybe Bill Belichick who made this, or somebody made it about Bill Belichick. I can't recall exactly, maybe you might know. They were talking about the culture of New England, and they were saying, like, no one in the Patriots has any fun when they train and they play in the season. It's not a fun place, but they win titles. You can go to another team, and you may win titles, you may not, but you might have a lot of fun. And one is not necessarily better than the other. It really depends on what your values are. When your career's over, do you want to say you had titles? Do you want to say maybe you tried but you had fun? Which one is it? I think Yancy just likes to compete the way Yancy likes to compete. He obviously wants to win, but I don't think he wants to like gear himself up for things he just isn't in order to, marginally increase his chance of victory. That's my read on this.
Sounds like Donald Cerrone to a degree.
Yeah, exactly.
Sound like
That's
Donald
true.
Cerrone.
Those guys looked in the mirror at each other a little bit. Maybe you're from Hawaii, maybe I'm from Albuquerque, but they could see each other in that reflection a little bit.
Cerrone was the first guy that I remember us. I think it was UFC 137. He did a post-fight scrum at Mandalay Bay. This was BJ Penn versus Nick Diaz, and he had just won a few in a row. Like he goes on these 5-fight winning streak, and then he drops one, and we're all like, "You want a title shot? Do you want this?" And he's like, "I just want to go to the strip club. I don't really care about your titles." And that was the first time that I remember
Wait, who said
hearing
this?
Donald Cerrone.
Yeah.
I remember hearing someone saying, "I don't care about the belt." Like Derek Lewis says it all the time now, and it's a little more common to hear someone say that. But that was the first time I remember hearing someone say, like, "I could not stop asking me about it. I just want to fight and get paid." I mean, a real prize fighter, if you will, right?
He's such a weird guy with distractions. Like, fighting is almost a distraction from certain things going on, and then he does other distractions to not think about the fight. And I think that the belt just added this extra distraction that he didn't want to deal with unless he had to, and then he would deal with it. I felt like he's one of those guys, he doesn't like to focus on what he's looking at. He likes to have a sideline.
Yeah.
If
there was an MMA Hall of Fame, he would go in at this point.
yeah.
If he never fights again. I mean, that's a Hall of
certainly
Fame
the one
career,
that the
right?
UFC runs.
No.
He has a
I'm
good
talking
shot
about a
because
real
because they love him.
I think
Because he
so.
always,
No, but like a real MMA Hall of
First of
Fame.
all, so GSP, we don't know if he comes back. If he does, maybe for another fight or something. And then Bisping's got one fight left. Well, this guy could shatter that. I mean, he's still got, to me, he still looks good. So he could win 5, 6, 7 more fights, and kind of shatter that record.
Yeah, so that alone would make him.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned it, the little stats that he has, the longevity.
It reads like somebody who's been dominating weight classes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I just wanted to say that you brought up the hugging and all that, and I love sportsmanship. I really like it when Medeiros gave him the cowboy hat at the weigh-ins, and they kind of like shook hands and like sort of were very friendly to each other. I like that kind of sportsmanship. I don't feel like these guys have to hate each other just to compete against each other. But there comes a point where when they're in the middle of a fight and one of them slips and falls down and they get up and they hug, it just bothers me. I just don't.
I'm happy you said that.
I don't like that. And the only thing that saved that moment for me was that, when a few minutes later, Cowboy had knocked him out. If they had gone on and had a fight, let's say they had gone, to a decision, and there would have been a lot of talk about, well, these guys like each other too much to really hurt each other or something. I mean, they had to fight very fiercely in order to make up for the fact that they were doing that. I just didn't. That stuff just. I feel like there's. That just puts a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah, Dana White has talked about that a lot, that he hates seeing that.
Pro Cop Barry, right? You mentioned this?
I felt like I was rewatching that fight. It went
like
a lot shorter, but I remember Pat Barry saying after the fact, I gave him too much respect, and I feel like that's what happened.
You can give respect before a fight. I mean, I love the respect before the fight. I love the touching gloves, all that stuff. But now the fight starts. The fight's got to be a fight.
Reverence or something. That's not respect anymore. That's just like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm fighting you. This is that kind of thing, it just goes overboard. I think it was you I was talking to about basketball, and you're like, a lot of these guys, the superstars, they're all buddies off the court.
Yeah.
So they're buddies on the court too, but they're competing. I like the old days when these guys hated, they couldn't stand losing usually. They didn't want to join forces. They wanted to go against him and beat him. You know, that's...
I agree.
So you have reverence for a guy or you have respect for a guy. Well, the whole thing is to beat him, right? Like, that's to be better.
You still, I mean, Bird and Magic were the fiercest competitors you could possibly be, and they loved each other. So you can play both sides of that fence, but everything has its place. And I feel as though
Isaiah
once
and
you're in
Magic
there,
only recently made up, man.
That's right. That's right.
My favorite kind of sportsmanship from that card was Melender not finishing off Thiago Alves.
That's
Yeah.
good. Okay.
Where you put it on him until it's not time to put it on.
Twice.
That kind of restraint is.
Yeah, you got-
is
So he had him,
hard.
didn't he knock him down once and he kind of let him recover a little too much? You're almost
Yeah.
like, whoa, you might have wanted to finish, try to
Yeah,
the
but then when
finish.
he
And then
closed the show with the
so it's
knee.
like he did it again. The second time he had all the incentive to go in there and he still knew he did it. So that second restraint, I was like, damn,
well,
man.
it reminds me of the Ngannou Overeem fight. I didn't feel like the second punch was necessary, and it's easy for us to sit here and say that they're in the heat of the moment, they want to win emphatically. But there's nothing more cringeworthy than seeing that guy like stiff as a board, and then the extra, Dan Henderson,
Yeah,
Michael
Dan
Bisping.
Henderson.
But then there's moments like Brian Stann and Alessio Sakara's guard and knocking him out, and didn't, he could have easily landed another punch that fight in Sweden. But I agree that's the right kind of sportsmanship. The hugging in the middle of the fight and all that.
Still, I would humbly submit, I think Cowboy would have won no matter what.
Regardless?
Yeah.
You don't feel like in hindsight, Medeiros may have gone in there with, I don't know, not enough of an edge? Not, like when you're putting off the impression that you're there, you're happy for the guy, you're going to help him up, you're going to hug him, it doesn't feel like you're going into a fight. It doesn't feel like you're going in there with a killer instinct.
I don't know. He looked like he was trying to give the
Yeah.
business to Cowboy to me. I mean, it's hard to know because
Sure, of
what
course.
it
It's
was
just
there's so many X factors.
Yeah.
I mean, Medeiros' his demeanor. How does that affect the typical anxiety that Cowboy experiences in a fight? Maybe he doesn't have any this day because the other guy is not being, mean mugging him. So yeah, there's so many X factors there. But I mean, I kind of agree with you, but I still like the fact. I love when competitors can approach each other as competitors and not like hated enemies. And then when the bell rings or when the referee waves them together, then they go at each other with the full force of themselves.
One more note about Cowboy, if we may. We always tell fighters, be yourself, share the world with yourself, which I think is aggregately good advice. Like, on balance, if everyone does that, that's the best way for you to get your story told. But the reality is, like anyone in media, the police, cooks, fighters, not everyone's interesting.
Yeah.
Some people are just boring.
Yeah.
Okay? Cowboy has always been himself, which is one thing. But he was always he just was a totally unique character. You ask these guys to be honest and tell their story because you're hoping that somebody like that comes along. It's not the act of storytelling that makes it better necessarily, although it can help. It's you got to make sure you have a story to tell. And he just always came along as authentic. I remember first time I ever had him in studio, I was the junior reporter. I'll never forget this. He came in studio, and like I was doing the whole bit. Would you fight so and so? Would you fight so and so? Because I was like. I didn't know what to do. And I remember the interview was over. This was in my hometown. And I couldn't have turned his mic off to go to commercial faster. The second I hit the button, and I wouldn't tell the story other than I know he just wouldn't care at this point. This was honestly like 10 years ago or something. Not quite that long, but a while. I turn off his microphone as we go to break. And he goes, "Hey man, where's the titty bar at?" first words out of his mouth. It was just, and like the PR guy was like horrified, But it was like so funny to me. He didn't care, totally unpretentious. He's always been who he's been. He's always going to be who he is. Either you're on board or you're not, and it seems like most people are.
And when you went there, did you guys have a good time there?
No, I did not go with him. I merely gave him directions.
And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I maintain you mentioned the Budweiser, I mentioned the hat, you mentioned Last of the Mohicans. Those things matter. And in this day and age, when an Arjun Buller can't even wear, his turban.
Well, now he can.
Well, now he can,
Yes.
but not initially.
Right.
And when, Joanne Calderwood can't wear a kilt, like those little things, if Donald Cerrone would have debuted in today's UFC, sans cowboy hat,
Right.
it's a totally different guy.
Right.
It's a totally different look. And so I hope they consider that. As we talked about last week, busy weekend last week in the world of MMA, last weekend, I should say. Bellator was on Friday, and I want to talk about Bellator here for a second, and I want to bring up something that our buddy on Twitter, Jedi Goodman, tweeted yesterday. So the ratings came out for the Bellator show, and the initial ratings were under 500,000, around 476, and then with the DVR, it went up above 500. That's a bad number for a show headlined by, the first real heavyweight fight of their heavyweight tournament. But what struck me even more than that was this. Okay, this is the number of Bellator events that have done under 500,000 in Spike Paramount history over the last few years. 2013, 2 out of 25 events did under 500,000. 2014, none out of 23 events. 2015, none out of 16 events. 2016, 1 out of 22. 2017, 7 out of 22. Wow. And 2018, 2 out of 3. There's only been 3 this year. What is going on with Bellator?
Boy, this is a great question. It is what I have been wondering all this time. Okay, so now there's some of that is a little bit misleading.
Why?
Well, because last year they went extensively to Europe in ways they hadn't in the years prior. Many of those shows are the European. Now, not all of them. I want to be clear about that, but a lot of them are.
Worth noting, but I don't think it takes away. That's their decision to go there, right?
It is their decision, but the question is, if they had just done domestic shows, what would they look like? What would the number look like?
Sure.
But fair enough to your point, they're willing to go to Europe and then risk getting these low numbers. I'm sure it has, you've interviewed Coco before. Well, there's things you don't understand. Well, there's things you don't understand. Okay, well, here's what I don't understand. What is that all about? So there must be some kind of European angle to this about whether they're giving content to overseas Viacom partners or however that's...
They're also probably getting paid, right?
I'm sure, but what's happening stateside, you're bleeding the product. Coke are doubling down on going back to Europe, but there's a bigger issue at play. It should be noted that there was some good competition for them. The Olympics is kind of hurting things a little bit. It didn't murder the UFC on Sunday night in the same way because it's the UFC and it's Donald Cerrone and it's Sage Northcutt, so it's a little bit different. But suffice to say that maybe if there was no Olympics, it would have been a little higher. But here's the major point. I was asking this to friends before, fans who are not MMA haters by any stretch of the imagination. They're casual, but they need an angle. And their question to me was, why would I ever watch Bellator? Like, what's the pitch? Because there's enough UFC content to fill you up. So you could say, well, what if there's a meaningful market alternative? But is there a meaningful market alternative? It's what is so radically different about the Bellator product today that it necessitates you going over there? Kimbo's not there anymore. So do you have extra star power? Do you have a different rule set? Do you have a different format? Does it look different? Does it sound or feel different? And there's good fighters there, but I don't understand what the Bellator pitch is at this point.
An alternative, perhaps.
Yeah, I was, I guess, a little surprised because I thought with that, with the two guys with some degree of name recognition, both of them with UFC pedigrees, so they've been in the octagon. People know who they are. They're it just seems like they both are guys who can finish you, and it's heavyweight. So I was surprised that a fight card headlined by Big Country and Meathead did not do better. But some of the stuff that was happening before it, I mean, I think that I wonder whether they lost some viewership. I mean, I don't always understand like the incremental. Minute by minute viewership and how they gain and lose viewership, but some of the stuff earlier in that card was difficult to watch. So I imagine that by the time the main event was happening, in my case, I DVR'd it because I was.
But don't focus on Friday only. There's a bigger issue here.
Yeah, of course.
There's a bigger issue in the last year and change. 9 events now.
Right, you're right, and that's why when
bad.
That's why when Luke mentions the Olympics, that was the same thing I was thinking, but that was only applied to this card.
Yeah.
I mean, look, they used to have.
What do you make of the Bellator product?
Used to have Kimbo Slice and these like freak show fight against Data 5000 and that kind of stuff, and now it seems as though they're trying to have more quote unquote legitimate fights, and it's coming across as second level.
It's a little bit alarming because even if you go back to December, I think it was when they had the Julia Budd fight it was a title fight, but they're going head to head against the UFC that night. Remember the Tough 26 finale. So they did something like 430,000, 440,000, and you thought, well, the UFC didn't even do great Gangbusters that night. It was like 500 and some thousand. You think, well, they kind of canceled each other out. The weird one about this is like just your core MMA fan, right? You think we'll tune in for stuff like Bellator. I think that's why they've sustained as long as they have. The core will always just kind of watch what's on, and I feel like that's kind of the weird thing about this because you do have a couple of marquee names or guys who traditionally people know their names, and you had other fights on there, just that were I don't know, but Patricki's been around for a long time. Some of the people on that card had been around long enough where you think like it just gives some more value to tuning in, but to see that number on that card on Friday night, I know the Olympics are going on, but it wasn't going against another MMA event.
Sure.
That was a little weird, man. You start to wonder about MMA's core audience at this point. That's what I'm worried about.
Yeah.
Is it starting to peel away? Are we starting to see some of them just don't care anymore? And I feel like that's the thing that has got, it was the core audience that for so long just pushed it. Like the people who come at us for every mistake we make, anything we say, those people, those rabid fans are the ones. And I feel like that somewhere along the way, there's a loose end there that we're just not getting the same, it's just not getting the same kind of attention anymore.
A couple of things. Number one, everyone on TV is suffering. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah.
Even Thursday Night Football's ratings are down. They got
Don't
higher.
believe the NBA is suffering.
Okay, but
NBA is killing it.
they might be. But I mean, I think
No, they are.
I understand, but most of everything on TV
Sure.
has suffered declines year over year, right? So that's one thing. And in particular, the UFC is suffering ratings declines as well. It's not just Bellator, but I mean, we're talking about, this is a uniquely bad number, but MMA generally, I think, is suffering. I don't know if it's a core audience or not. To me, I think, look, here's the deal. Like, people still like MMA. It's pretty clear. If you bring back something with a hook, they will watch. It's not. Jim Lampley said in that article, I think it was I forget who wrote it, but basically, look, as long as two men are out there fighting, people are going to pay money to watch. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter much more than that. But here's the truth: if you've watched MMA the last 10 years, the notion of MMA itself is no longer exciting. Just like the notion of basketball isn't exciting. The NBA is really good about finding stars, recruiting them, and have this interesting process and generating regional bias and all kinds of rivalries. And these stars hang on for decades, right? That's a real critical component here that MMA doesn't enjoy. In other words, when the Ultimate Fighter hit, people were like enamored with MMA, and of course, as their taste began to refine, it aligned with certain fighters and everything else. But now you can't just surf on MMA being popular anymore. You can't just surf on the idea that people will just watch fights. What is the hook? That applies to Bellator. It applies to UFC too. That's why people will come out for pay-per-view. They will come out for stars. They will come out for something particularly exciting. I do think Khabib versus Tony, I don't know what it will do, but I think it will do really well.
Sure.
Because it's exciting. It's tied to something. But just trotting out fights anymore? Nope, not going to work.
Might even be for a real belt.
Look, oversaturation.
Hopes up.
Yeah, really.
Oversaturation is real. It really is. And MMA is feeling it right now. There is just too much MMA on TV, in my opinion. There's too much MMA, period. I'm not just talking about the UFC or Bellator. I believe Bellator puts on too many events. I don't think they have the roster for this many events, 25 or so.
It's insane. It's totally insane.
The brilliance of Strikeforce was, it was small. It started with like 8 events, and then it got a little bigger. There was a clear distinction between Challenger Series and the big shows. There is no distinction of that. There's a Friday and Saturday here, but it's a little different. Bellator is putting on fights, like the Heather Hardy fight should not have been televised. That fight should have been on the prelims, and it seems like sometimes they don't know what they want to be. I still don't know what their women's division is. I mean, it comes across as the pretty girl division, that those are the people that they push, but they need to be better than that. And if they don't want to go fully in on women's MMA, then develop stars in the prelims and win the race. They put guys like Ed Ruth and Tyler Fortune, who are way more accomplished and better MMA fighters right now, on the prelims, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't have Mitrione and Nelson and then have those two. And that's no knock on them. Heather Hardy's a phenomenal human being and an inspiration, but that's not TV level stuff. My one point is, I think Bellator needs to stay the course, but I think they need to be reflective, like, okay, what are we? Let's not try to be, like, I think a big mistake is that desk. Let's look at what the UFC is doing. Their shows are too long. They drag.
God.
Let's copy it. And I asked someone at Bellator, why did you introduce this desk? Like, this desk just feels like Foxlight. They said, we did focus groups and people like the desk. I said, I guarantee you those people aren't MMA fans. MMA fans don't want the desk. They want action. They want to move, tell stories, give me a package on this guy. They don't want to see hyperbole and all that. And then how about the idea of putting Big John McCarthy, who's like your X's and O's guys? I mean, like, that is your John Madden. To put him there in the hype man role to sell a fight just doesn't work. It does not work. And so I feel like they're trying to figure themselves out, but I feel like they need to, like, they're lucky that Viacom owns them because they're not going to pull the plug. They have great backing, but they need to kind of figure, like, this.
Yeah, but they can't float forever.
They absolutely can't float forever. Mohegan Sun, they drew well, like, they know their partners, but even the tournament, I think they they bet too big on the tournament. You know, they dragged it out. It's not a real tournament. I don't think it has captivated people's attention the way the Strikeforce tournament did.
When's the next one?
The next one is in April.
And
They're
then
skipping
Bader Mo is in May.
May.
Oh,
That's ridiculous. That's too far.
The first 4-round
although
fights should have been
Fedor
on the
versus
same
Mir
night.
might do pretty well.
That will feel special because it's two big names, but it doesn't feel like we're in a tournament here.
No, you're right.
Like the NCAA tournament, the brilliance of it is that it all happened March Madness, right? You can't do it this way. So these don't feel like tournament fights. They just feel like fights.
You don't think it's like January, February, April, May, March madness? You don't think they?
No, there's not even one in March.
Millennial madness. I wanted to just jump back quickly to one thing. Because the Hardy fight was hard to watch. There's no
It was one
question
of the
about
worst fights I've ever seen.
But I think
but honestly, they
they
were set up. They were set up.
She is who she is.
Yes,
But
yes.
in hindsight, it was a horrible thing to see. But I think that in defense of Bellator's matchmaking there, you know, they've got two women who have been boxing champions, and I think they're imagining they're going to get these two in there, and they're going to get a boxing
We've
match.
seen them in
essentially.
MMA fights before.
And they ended up, you know, wrestling and if anything else, it's sort of. I actually learned a lesson. I learned that I've never trained in martial arts, but I've watched thousands of fights, and I always thought that if there were
You're on revenue over here.
if there were a moment where I got into some kind of thing where I had to like deal with some person, I'm like, well, you know, I've seen so many fights, I could probably. Well, then I watched Heather Hardy try to like do a choke and try to do this, and just by not being in the right position, it was like, holy crap, she looked like she's starting to do the right thing, but it wasn't working. So it kind of was like informative for those of us thinking, well, you know, this stuff, you know, you just got to put your arm around this person, around their neck, and it doesn't work. I mean, so yes, it was a hard thing to watch because these women clearly are not mixed martial artists. But I think that their thinking when they were going in was, okay, we're gonna throw these two women who have boxing pedigrees and let them go at it, and it just didn't work out.
Also, you see tournaments in boxing. You remember the was it the
Super Six.
Super Six tournament?
That one lasted 2 years.
Right, which was a bit of a disaster. But even that held on because it was like legitimate fighters in that contest, for by and large anyway.
Yeah.
And this one is just it's the best of what they have available, and of course there are some very legitimate talents in there. I tend to think Ryan Bader's probably going to win the whole thing, but well, I suppose we'll see. So there is some mystery to it. But I just don't feel like promoters are listening. You know what's amazing? Promoters used to be able to get away with whatever they wanted because the fans would be like, hey, we want to give you this. Yeah, I want that. Yeah, that's great. We want to give you that next year. Oh, okay, that sounds awesome too. And now you're beginning to see, yeah, we don't want that anymore.
Because there's so much, right?
Well, now again, it's this, the first couple hits of it were like, oh, this is euphoric. And now it's like, well, okay, I understand what this process feels like. I understand what it's about. Now I need something that's tailored to me. Now I need something that I'm giving you a response about. You know, the fans are speaking up. And I don't really know that the promoters are listening. Now, partly the UFC's locked into this contract. They just have to do things at this point. But they are like, you know, they are crawling to the finish line on this Fox deal a little bit. It's kind of shocking. I do think they're going to get a good deal next because even Thursday Night Football declining, it still did super sick money. So they'll be all right. I'm not, people are like, it's the demise of MMA. It's not the demise of MMA, but it's MMA coming to earth in a way that promoters have been sitting fat and happy out there as hard as their jobs are, and they are very difficult because they could just give you their vision, and MMA was so hot and so unique and so interesting, they would just buy it. Those days, I'm telling you, are over.
And what's also interesting is that the UFC's oversaturation problem trickles down to the likes of Bellator, right? Then Bellator suffers as a result of the fact that there's too much UFC.
But then they make their own case worse by doing, we're going to do 30 shows. Like, why?
And,
why would you do that?
and so I said, stay the course. You know, figure it out. Maybe scale back if you can, maybe not. But here's what concerns me. What concerns me is they try to go for the quick fix. They go for a Tito Chuck 3 situation. And they go back to what they were 2 or 3 years ago, where they're getting $2 million plus for Royce versus Ken Shamrock. And now, yeah, the product is suffering, and they're putting on, you know, sometimes these Heather Hardy fights. But if you actually look at what's going on as of late, like you can see it starting. James Gallagher, AJ McKee, you know, Fortune, Ruth, like the young guys are coming. The Rockholds and the Cain Velasquez and the Daniel Cormiers, they're starting to find those guys. But I'm afraid that we're going to see Tito Chuck 3 in Bellator.
Oh, yeah,
is there an
will.
appetite? You think we will?
Yeah, because of what you said. I mean, it's funny, but like the last wave of this, when we started seeing these kind of, you know, either freak show fights or fights of people who were in their prime, a long, long time ago. I kind of was okay with it because I thought, okay, they're going to make that their main event. Then they're going to try to promote some of their younger, more viable athletes and make a name for these guys. But what's happened is, as your numbers show here, that once you take away that fight that fight of the has-beens, let's say, those other folks are not drawing the kind of numbers that you think you might have been building them into some kind of star power by having them fight underneath the Hoist fight or a Kimbo fight, and it doesn't seem like it's happening. These people are they are who they are, and so bringing in Chuck and Tito, yeah, maybe that'll bring some numbers, but that's not the important number. The number that's important is the next card, the one after that, and the one after that, when they don't have that fight there. How are they going to use it to build something? And it seems like they haven't been able to.
Chuck, can I ask you a crazy question? Is it possible that Bjorn Rebney was right all along?
This has been an experiment.
The tournament. Is the tournament better? The 13-week season, is that better because it's so different?
Well, I will say to remove, and it didn't work at the time. Like people just didn't pay any attention to what was going on in those brackets. But at least there was a thought of how are we going to be number 2 or number 3 in the case when they first were trying. But like, how are we going to occupy the space? I think what we're saying is it's very difficult to be number 2. I mean, it's just very tough to find, especially given all those new parameters, like the fans, just their tastes change, the inundation, everything else. How do you be number 2? I don't know. I mean, I go back. I would criticize. It's almost like you're going to criticize them if they do Chuck and Tito. You're going to criticize them if they put, somebody else who doesn't do numbers. I don't know. It's there's no happy place for them to exist, other than to do what you're saying and raise guys that have compelling, like you said, angles, reasons to pay attention, and eventually they get that going. But right now, man, it's a changing climate, and I don't even know if Chuck and Tito, like it's weird. People would know their names, but I'm not even sure what that would do at this point.
You know what it does?
I think it would do well.
It does over $1 million?
Yeah. Buys?
No.
They would put that on pay-per-view, don't you think?
Oof. In this day and age?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think they would.
You think so?
Mm-hmm.
But let's say they did. What would the number be? I mean, because what is their number before when they did something that was like 100,000?
100,000 or give or take, yeah.
Yeah. Better than that, though? I mean,
I think it does better than that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or they put it on Spike, and yeah, it does over $1 million.
You want to see it?
No. I got one word for you. Transformers. More than meets the eye. That's the taste level here.
I'd watch if it was this Chuck.
Yeah, if it's that Chuck versus Tito.
I go against my handle
Do you
of
think
Tito's
that
every
these
night.
ratings will cause someone to panic and book a fight like this?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, if past is prologue, probably. And, there are a lot of differences, key differences between this and the demise of Japanese MMA. I know a lot of people are trying to make the connection. And there are some obvious parallels, but there's a lot of differences. But one of the lessons you can take is that they, and for different reasons, which is why the situations are not analogous, but when you don't build in a sustainability factor, and you're right, by the way, being number 2 is, I'm sitting here criticizing it, but it's very hard to do that. Very hard to do that. But if you don't build in a sustainability factor, which is really the UFC's responsibility, then these sort of circus elements become more and more attractive because they're quick hits. But what that ultimately does is just undermine the product overall to the point where even then those don't begin to work and then the whole thing collapses. Now there are situations very, very different, and I can't be clear about that. However, to the point you're raising, you've got these Gallaghers and McKees and some other ones to work with, and then now you're like, we got to get that Tito Chuck thing 3 to really fix it. I'm not saying that brings down the organization, but that is, over the long haul, a big problem.
Speaking of Bellator, is there a lesson to be learned from the Will Brooks situation where here's a guy who was a champion, who was obsessed with the idea of being in the UFC, who took a pay cut to go to the UFC, and of course we know what happens. He goes 1-3, he gets cut, he's now fighting in the PFL or will fight in the PFL. We'll see if they ever get off the ground, but we suspect at this point they will. Sometimes, isn't it just better to be a big fish in a small pond? Isn't it better to just keep, like the days, Justin Gaethje turned down big money from Bellator and it's worked out pretty well for him in the UFC, but I feel like the fighters need to sort of rejigger the way they think. Like, it's okay to be, Michael Chandler is a perfect example of this. It's okay to make big money for the number 2, right?
Ben Askren, he made big money fighting, fighting who? I mean, really. He made a ton of money and good for him. Good for him. You know.
Although he is campaigning to be in the UFC now. So.
Well, but he's campaigning to get a big fight.
Sure.
I mean, and that's a whole different thing than trying to go in there. And, you know, if he had gone in there 4 or 5 years ago, and had to sort of fight his way through the killers in that weight class, it's a whole different story. Now he's looking to get the big fight, and good for him.
I don't know if there's a lesson so much as that it's puzzling to look at that. And you feel bad in some ways for Will Brooks because the grass was not greener for him to go on the other side. And the bottom line is, I mean, he won his first fight, right? But it was a close one. But he was riding like an 8-fight win streak. He'd beaten Chandler a couple times. You felt like he was positioned to kind of be something for Bellator, like something of because he was their guy, right? He comes up through them. And you look at something like that and you think, he was never more than, I mean, he never had the intrigue I thought he might when he came over even. They gave him the kind of an anonymous fight in his first one, then he starts to lose and he can't get out of that funk and now he's not even there anymore. So it was never like he even transcended a certain, because when he first came over, I was like, oh wow, there's a partition down now, you get to see Will Brooks against this guy, or all these guys, you're just thinking of that. We didn't really see him against many of those guys because he couldn't get to them. And so now it's just one of those things you think like, I don't know if it's a lesson, but it makes you think that the grass isn't necessarily greener. Yeah. And a lot of these guys, especially during that time, were both sides. There was a little bit, some guys kind of wanted the UFC just because they did, the sponsors and all that going to Bellator. Well, we're talking about Bellator. I don't know what the lesson is there, honestly.
I mean, you have to be able to perform, and this is not the WWE where they can build a story around you. You have to go out there and perform. I mean, you mentioned Gaethje. I remember his first fight when he fought Michael Johnson. Yeah. He looked like he was going to get finished pretty early, and I remember thinking, oh yeah, so the story of Justin Gaethje is going to be, you were great in your old fight game, but now you stepped up to the UFC, and you realize you're in over your head, and that looked like the narrative for him until he twisted the story around in his favor. So now he's got a whole different story, but it was like the blink of an eye. It could have been different for him.
I don't really know what the lesson is here. I mean. I'm with Chuck on this one because you spoke to him, I spoke to him as well, and I was like trying to figure out like what went wrong, and I don't know what the answer is because I think people are going to call me crazy at this point, but I still think he can beat a lot of very good fighters in the UFC.
I agree.
I asked him were you unhappy during this time because some of these guys they got like he was in Bellator, that could affect you. He's like, no, not really. I was pretty happy. Maybe there were some issues about concentration and focus. Maybe that's it. I don't really. The thing is, I can't really make heads or tails of why all of a sudden he's this amazing fighter and then it goes in this terrible losing streak. Certainly in the case of Michael Chandler, you could say that sticking with Bellator probably has been a long-term benefit. But I'm a little hesitant to draw conclusions about Will Brooks other than we'll see what happens in the PFL.
Yeah, I do think that there is something to be said for, if it's going well, don't mess it up. Like, it happened to Hector Lombard too. He was killing it in Bellator. He wants to leave.
He got paid when he left, though.
Exactly. Yeah, he did get paid.
Something to be said for that too.
Absolutely. But it felt like things were going so well, and then all of a sudden, a change of scenery sometimes messes with you for various reasons. And so I think there's a little lesson there. Of course, everyone's always, I think, still in this day and age going to be, enamored with the idea of fighting in the UFC because they are number one, and I get that. But it's sometimes okay, I do believe, to be that big fish in a small pond. Before we put a bow on last weekend, could we just very quickly once again celebrate the brilliance of Nate Diaz, who literally appears on television for, I think I counted 8 seconds, and yet it felt like he was the star of the weekend in many respects. I mean, it's just amazing how much this guy does with so little. Like, he just shows up there, does a little quick thing with a joint or a blunt. I still don't know what the difference is. People are still weighing in on that.
I can show you the difference later if you want to.
Okay, but it's just amazing.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
Isn't it not amazing? Like, I just couldn't help but sit there and laugh at just how brilliant he is. I mean, the knock on the Diaz brothers, and we've talked about this before, is that they're not smart. He is so freaking smart. He is one of the smartest people in the history of this sport.
Right.
And that was just a perfect example of it.
Following the Derek Lewis thing, too.
Yes.
I mean, that 1 minute.
The sequence
that 1 minute.
Brilliant.
Derek Lewis talking about Bellator and then talking about the wife. And then that was the greatest in the history of the Fox, UFC relationship. That was it. That 1 minute.
You could do a
silent.
podcast between Lewis and Diaz.
Oh my God.
Put it on Fox and
if
just to see how much they panic.
If you went back just a little bit further, they tried to beep out an F word during during the fight, right?
Yeah.
And they missed it. They beep out the wrong word, and you still hear the F word. So it was like it was off to that, and then the Lewis thing, and then that. I was like, it's like the inmates around the asylum.
You know, it's interesting because I know that he has since moved on from it, but there's a case to be made that I know some people accuse Tyron Woodley of being a whiner. I personally, none of that stuff bothers me, but I can understand why people might think that way. But in some degree, he's being rebellious, right?
Yeah.
To some degree, he's pushing back. Nate Diaz, people love his rebelliousness. They love the fact that he does it. Now, he does it in a very different way, rather than complaining about, well, he's complaining, let the fair finish to Tyron Woodley. Nate Diaz has done his fair share of complaining as well, like around the Rafael dos Anjos fight. But he sort of figured out a different way. It turns out that you can complain if you do it almost symbolically, if you just challenge authority. Conor McGregor, for example, you don't think he has complaints, but he waits until he wins and goes, okay, I believe I've earned it. But, you know, if you'd asked him 48 hours earlier, it would have been like, man, I've earned this.
Yeah.
No. You know, he would feel like he was entitled to something. It's the fans want to do it as long as you are this challenge to authority now, because it used to be, if Dana White said anything, it was gospel. I mean, I can't tell you how many times he would say something like, the sky is green. I'd be like, fellas, the sky is not green. Dana said it. It must be true. Trust me, it's not. The worm is turned on that one. Now there's eager to have that pushed back. And so if you can do that in a creative way where you kind of put your arm around the fan and bring them along with you, oh my God, will they cheer for you.
He's very timely. It's like you're talking about like some of the timing on all this stuff, like McGregor after a win. Well, he's timely. He shows up in Orlando. He handles that situation right before the whole Diaz, right before the whole McGregor thing. He couldn't have handled himself better. Even during that scrum when he's signing the poster and he's doing all that stuff, he's drawing a strange kind of compelling, compels you to pay attention to him, which is just a different kind of fighter, right? But the thing I love about him is each time he kind of goes away, when he shows back up, it's like he's reminding you how much you miss him.
Yeah.
That's what he basically does. Because there's a lot of times, even right now, I'm like, I still don't know to what extent his star power will be out there if he fights somebody other than McGregor. Like, how many people will really, in the larger picture, tune in? We'll see. That's to me is a compelling side product of this whole thing. But each time he comes on, though, I feel like there's this magnetism towards him. He has a certain kind of magnetism, you know what I mean? Like, it is, like you said, it's a very unique brand of his rebelliousness. And he's showing it again. He flaunts it. He just flaunts it in front of everybody.
I think there's nothing to stop him.
Yeah. He is who he is. He is real, and he's the guy who everybody wants to be that way to their boss or to the people who employ them. Everybody would love to be able to do the things that he does, and he gets to do it. And that so there's a certain percentage of the MMA viewing public that lives vicariously through this guy, and you know, and why not?
There's a lot of ways to be popular. Actually, turns out you can do the St. Pierre route, and that's one way. Another way is, and you saw it in Cowboy, you see it in Yancy, you see it in Nate Diaz, all to varying degrees. You see it in Conor to a certain extent. Just give 0 Fs.
Yeah.
Fans love it when their favorite fighter or the guy who can become their favorite fighter just gives 0 Fs about how they're going to just live life. They're going to do things on their schedule. They're going to say what they want to say, and they're going to be who they want to be. And then when they, you know, if it's compelling enough and they win enough and they do interesting things, you can amass a pretty sizable following doing that.
There's also a lesson with Nate Diaz in that it takes time to develop a cult-like following, right? It doesn't happen overnight, and I think that while we can all talk about the ratings and stuff and criticize, and I do my fair share, these things don't happen. Like, there were times where he was fighting Rory and Roy Markham and Roy McDonald, and a lot of just sort of, you know, their fights in the middle of a card. He wasn't always, you know, you may be new to MMA, but he wasn't always like this. He was his brother's kid brother. He was in the shadows of Nick.
Right.
And
I remember when he lost to Hermes Franca.
Yeah, so it does take time. It's amazing what he does now. It's amazing the following.
He should have been huge after the Pellegrino thing, right? Like, just things like that. If he does it now, it's a cult happening.
Sure,
you know what I mean?
I would love to know the answer to your question, though. Just how popular is he? You know, I was wondering last year when they were talking about him versus Tony Ferguson, I thought it could do $1 million. I still maintain he could do very well without a belt on the line.
I wouldn't be surprised anymore. You know? That's the whole thing. I think that he does have that kind of shine now. People just pay attention to him. But at the same time, we haven't seen it. So it's kind of like you got to see it.
I'd love to know the answer to that question. Speaking of Nate Diaz, how about this segue? Nate Diaz fought for the UFC lightweight title a little over 5 years ago in Seattle, Washington on Fox against Benson Henderson. That fight didn't go his way. At the pre-fight press conference, Dana White trotted out a young female named Ronda Rousey and announced that she was the new UFC women's bantamweight champion, the first women's champion in UFC history. 2 months later, at UFC 157 on February 23rd of 2013, Ronda Rousey fought Liz Carmouche in the first ever female fight in UFC history. The 5-year anniversary of that fight is tomorrow, Friday. And so, and credit to Chuck for reminding, I'm usually the one who remembers these weird things, but credit to Chuck for remembering that anniversary. First of all, any of you there?
No.
There?
No, it's my son's birthday, so I had to be home.
February 23rd.
Yes.
I respect it. We all watched it. It was a big moment. I wanted to reflect on it and sort of see where we've come. You know, we all remember Dana saying women will never fight on TMZ. They obviously fight. They're obviously a big part of the UFC now. They're a big part of the sport. 5 years later, is it moving the way we may have predicted 5 years ago? Is it moving in the right direction, or is it still sort of the the Ronda show, the pretty girl show? How do we feel about the state of women's MMA 5 years after that, that historic moment?
It's, you look back on it and you think none of it exists. Oh, it's hard to know if it would exist, to what extent it would exist in the UFC or not. Maybe it doesn't ever, But the bottom line is, I mean, you look at everything that's unfolded, a lot of compelling things have happened within the women's ranks, in that time. It's crazy that it only happened 5 years ago for it to be in this spot, because in so many now pay-per-views and things like that, either a pay-per-view is getting a, Amanda Nunes fight or something like that, or a Fox card traditionally would have a Paige Van Zandt or a, Rose Namajunas. There's people like that popping up on those. They populated their bigger spots with these female fighters, and it's worked perfect. I feel like a lot of these, there's so much cool storytelling going on with those women. And so I look back on that a little fondly. I'm like, as she came in, I didn't know 100% how it would come over, you know what I mean? In other sports, it just can't, WNBA is never going to compete with the NBA. They're not going to get equal footing. They're not going to get equal highlight packages. But in the UFC, for whatever reason, it couldn't have been a bigger women's movement ever. I mean, like, it just slid right in, boom. It was bigger than, and some of the players were bigger. Misha Tate at the time, these were bigger players than almost everybody else on the roster. So it's one of those seismic, weird things that has happened in our sport, but it's pretty awesome. When you think back on it, about where we are, with multiple divisions now, and really, at the time, I remember thinking Ronda Rousey, but there's really not a big depth at 135. But you look at how much depth there is at that division now, and you think, and how good so many of them have gotten, and how they could begin to compete with her at some point, and everything else. Just pretty amazing, man, in just 5 years' time. So
I sort of wonder, I remember watching that fight and thinking, as you probably remember, Carmouche got her back and had her in like a, she was trying to choke her, but she got her in like a neck crank, and I remember thinking, is women's fighting in the UFC going to start and end tonight? Because really, if
Do you
Rousey,
think it would have? Do you think they would have pulled the plug?
I don't know whether they would have pulled the plug, but I think it might have fizzled. I mean, Rousey the whole thing started because of Ronda Rousey, and we kind of forget, because she went on to be so dominant against everybody else she competed against until she met Holly Holm. But that fight, she was very close to losing that fight, and if this woman who they created the whole thing for goes out there for the first time and just gets finished in a minute or so, does Dana White just say, nice experiment, but
sliding doors, Liz Carmouche taps her out in that first fight. You don't know how much that even affects the sale that comes up later on. That's how big it was. She had, and then of course, like from 170 to 190, UFC 170, 190, when she fights 2 minutes and 10 seconds through 4 fights, and that hysteria. I mean, probably
does it even happen?
Doesn't happen. I don't think it can happen. I don't think anybody can do that again.
Where they sell out, 55,000 in Melbourne, headlined by her. Crazy. But do you think that it has progressed properly? Is it in a good place? Do you feel like, there's no doubt that they've been a huge benefit for the UFC. They can headline shows. In fact, the next pay-per-view is headlined by 2 females, Cyborg and Kunitskaya.
And the one after that has another title fight.
That's right. And they're 2 of the biggest stars in the UFC right now, Joanna and Rose. How do you feel about where it's come in 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's. You would have to be a real negative person, which I have no problem being. But in this case, I do think it's a pretty big success story. I think what's interesting to me is when I think about Ronda Rousey's legacy. There's a lot of different things you think about the biggest moments. I still think about her losses as her biggest moments, to be quite honest, which is a little bit bizarre because it shouldn't be that way because her record was so distinguished. But I get it.
There's no resolve.
There was no resolve. So it's
Even the Nunes one, like the Nunes one, almost feels like it didn't happen.
Man, that stands out in my memory.
Really?
Very vividly.
Wow.
I remember I was watching this thinking, what is about to happen? Because you knew if she gets redemption, there's a chance here. Right. But if things went badly, the plug was going to get pulled. And sure enough, it's what happened. But I think that like a lot of people are looking around saying, well, where's the next generation of female stars? Like the 500,000 and more pay-per-view buy rates. Maybe that has lagged a little bit. And it's still all very new. 5 years is nothing.
Sure. Yeah.
So you don't want to be like overly dramatic about it. But I think Chuck's point is right, man. Look at how much a part of the UFC the female experience really is at this point. It's significant. 3 divisions. You have, as I mentioned, not insignificant roles either. Entire 2 seasons devoted to the Ultimate Fighter about it. I mean, they're just a major priority and they're a major component, and they've gotten significantly better. I think there's still a very long way to go. I think there's still some talent development issues, pretty clearly on the regional level as well. So it's not like they fixed it or something. It's still got there's progress that's needed. But you want to talk about maybe the most important catalyst, it probably is that fight, or certainly her career more generally.
It's amazing that MMA, which sometimes gets this reputation of being like, very alpha male and not really progressive when it comes to,
Oh, you mean a fair reputation? I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's clothing attire or the broadcast still using the same music as 10 years ago. But here's a sport that headlines shows with 2 females, and the largely male-dominant crowds don't even bat an eye. It's amazing. Can you imagine if ABC had a doubleheader on a Sunday afternoon and it was, Warriors, Cavs, followed by the Liberty versus the Sparks?
I know.
It just wouldn't fly. Like MMA, women's tennis. I think the tennis player. Women's golf to a degree, depending on stars, but not really these days.
Really, not golf, but with tennis, the biggest stars in the game have been women for a long time.
Absolutely, and you see in the Olympics, with figure skating and skiing, gymnastics. Those are, but like as far as like a consistent product, week in and week out, you can headline a show.
Ronda Rousey, honestly, in that sense, because I feel like she I wouldn't say single-handedly, but she was a huge catalyst for that, just making that transition.
Sorry, Jeff. What's really interesting is like, again, it's only been 5 years. So let's see what happens.
Yeah.
But there's been no one who has been like her. Like, in other words, not nearly as popular, but like no one fights like her. You know what I mean? Have you noticed that like there's been no other fighter that even remotely? You could talk about her teammate who kind of fizzled out a little bit. I forget her name, but
Ronda's teammate?
Yeah.
Jasmine Duke?
No, the other one.
Marina
the one who
Shafir?
Shafir, the other judoka. And she was a quite talented judoka, international class level. But no one's ever been able to do anything like she does. Like, it wasn't just that she reached these heights. You can pretty clearly tell she was very, very unique, not really in the history of women's MMA, but MMA more generally.
Mackenzie Dern, the next Ronda?
Very different games, dude.
Yeah.
Completely different games.
Does she have what it takes? They're hoping.
We'll see. I'm a little skeptical, but we'll see. I'm not going to say yes or no. We'll see.
Her debut is next week, by the way.
Yep.
I was just going to follow up on Luke's thing that this was not necessarily just Rousey bringing the women's game into the sport and elevating that, but it really elevated all of the sport, because look at the popularity, look at the doors that opened because of Ronda Rousey that put eyes on the men. The male fighters as well, and so some of the guys who are making some bucks these days, have Ronda Rousey to thank for that as well.
And the majority of the audience won't care about this, but I think selfishly, from our perspective as journalists, what a pleasure it is to talk to the women sometimes. Like moms. And, I remember when Kat Zingano walked out for her first fight against Misha, and that's the first mom to fight in the UFC, and she's crying. They just bring a different perspective. It's fun covering them, especially early on. It was fun because the males bring something to the table, and then you have these characters like Joanna, and it's just different with them, and different in a great way. So I feel like we're lucky that we get
the first
that
openly
diversity.
gay fighter champion is now the champion in bantamweight. I mean, so there's.
Well, how about the fact that if Amanda Nunes ends up fighting Raquel Pennington for the belt, it would be the first time that two openly gay fighters fight for the belt.
Right. So I mean, there's so many different barriers that have been knocked down that really are beyond the mere fact that women were not fighting in the UFC. There's so many other things that have developed because of that.
Scale of 1 to 10, how excited are we for UFC on Fox 28 this weekend?
Ooh.
Very excited? Minimally excited?
6.
It's just a part of my Saturday.
It is. Just another show.
Get up, get coffee, watch the fights.
There's some decent fights on it, but I mean, the main event obviously is like, I think what everybody looks at and says like, come on.
Yeah.
But,
The fact that it's on at 8 is like,
yeah, I do like
okay,
that.
I don't loathe it now.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That is the best
And
part.
done by 10, you're out of there.
Is it sad that that's the best part?
Yes. Yes.
Oh my.
It is
All
really
right. Well, that's happening this
No,
weekend.
to be fair, yeah, and then of course Angela Hill's on this card.
Sure.
That's good.
Platinum Perry.
Platinum
always
Perry,
fun.
we can't go wrong with Platinum
Yeah.
Perry. So that it's
Morale.
Barao against Kelleher,
yeah. So it's not that there's not redeeming features.
And kudos to Platinum Perry. I heard him on your show on Monday, and it was pretty amazing to listen to him tell his story.
He's a great guy.
He's another real one.
Yeah.
He's another one of those.
You need guys like that, but he has to win.
Yes,
Of course.
doesn't
He
have
has
to win. But he takes risks, and he tells his story for all its ups and its downs, and there's some bad parts to it.
Yeah.
He tells it. you know.
Yep, he certainly does. All right, so that is this weekend, UFC on Fox in Orlando, Florida, back in Orlando, site of that Nate Diaz drawing on the poster incident, if you
Worst
will.
big city in America.
Is that true? No. They've got Disney World there.
Right.
That's bad? All right.
And your kid gets eaten by a crocodile, or you
That's
get
true.
Ebola.
That is,
one of the two.
That is true. That is true. So stay tuned for that. We are out of time. We appreciate you watching today's program, and we will be back next week to talk about whatever else is going on. And that, of course, is just days before UFC 222. I won't be here, but these guys will, and our Phil and Danny Segura, the Colombian kid, the always reliable Danny Segura. He appears whenever he is needed, even on short notice.
Niño Colombiano.
There you go. But for now, we shall say goodbye for the rest of the crew, for Luke, for Jeff, for Chuck. I am Ariel. Again, thank you so much for watching. Enjoy your weekend and enjoy the fights.